Let's talk about data binding in Android. Here I have a very simple application with 3 buttons in there. Let's go to our main activity and look at the code. In main activity, we initialize 3 variables, button 1, button 2, and button 3. And we reference each of these elements on our application by findViewById function. This function takes a type and an ID of the button on the page. Now this is normally okay to do if you have a small application with not many elements on your view. However, if you have a big number of elements on your page and a fairly complex application, this may not be optimal, because every time you call findViewById, Android searches from the root all the way down into your application to find the actual element you're looking for. So we don't want to call this every time we want to reference something. So let's see how we can do this a lot easier via the binding method from Android. Now, what is the data binding? Data binding allows you to easily access any of these variables by narrowing down the areas of search when you reference elements. So to get data binding enabled on your application, we have to go to your bundle.gradle in your app section. And here, you have to enable data binding. So under this section here, under before build type, you have to type in data binding enable equals true. And then press the sync now button. This will sync the data binding elements to your page. Now, one thing before you write code is that you have to update your activity main XML, because you need to narrow down the data binding stuff to just the stuff inside of your activity. So in order to do that, you have to wrap the whole thing here in a layout tag, smaller case layout tag, and then you have to wrap the whole thing inside of it. This will allow data binding this will tell data binding that the elements that you're looking for is inside what's inside the layout tags. So now this is done, we can go into our code. So to enable data binding, we have to set up a variable to hold all of our bindings. So we have to do it outside of onCreate. So let's initialize a private variable. We'll use late init because we don't know what the value is yet. So let's call this binding. The traditional is usually we call this binding. And then we want to call this activity main binding. Now this will auto import the activity main binding class. This class was auto generated by Android to help you make a reference to all the bindings inside of activity main. Now there's another thing we need to use, and that is the DataBindingUtil. So we have an initializer variable, but let's set it to something during the onCreate. So instead of all of this, we're going to do a better way. So let's set binding to DataBindingUtil, and then do set content view. Now this is how you do set the layout of this thing. So you do you pass this as a first variable, that's context, and then r.layout.activity main. So this replaces this, right? So you can just do that. So how do we reference each buttons? So right now, if you want to reference buttons, it used to be this way, but we can do it much easier now. So now we can do val. Let me comment this out first. So now we can do val button 1 is binding dot button 1. You see, now it finds all the values that the button references that you need, all within this binding variable. And this optimized for the application. Now it doesn't need to look at all the view all the way from the root to your activity to look for this particular elements. And now this should still work if you run the application, and if you go to, so here I'm just logging out the text of each button. So if we do it correctly, we should see like button 1, button 2, button 3 getting printed out in the console here. So give it a second for the Gradle build to finish. And it looks like our application is starting to run. So our application is running, and as you can, and now we can delete these things, and you can use this for almost any items on your activity. So any of these controls here, you can reference it with the binding variable. This is extremely nice because this variable, since it's late in it and it's outside of the function, you can reference it from any lifecycle functions or within any context. So it's super useful. So I hope you find this little video useful when you work on making references to your controls on your UI. So I will see you guys next time.